here?
Yep, sure.
Ready.
Okay. Ready?
Welcome to the TMRN Time Monk Radio Network. I'm Jules, and today is the 5th of March 2011. Today we have researcher, financial analyst, time monk, and former school teacher, George Ure. George's websites are urbansurvival.com, peoplenomics.com, and independencejournal.com. Hi, George. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on. The WebBot Forum Administrator... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Thanks. The WebBot Forum Administrator is Fox, and today he will be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several members of the forum were kind enough to join us tonight. They include members Romans 828, Uranus Rising, Cat, Dead Poet, Chuck, Lua, and Groundrod. For listeners, this interview will assume you are familiar with George and his work, which means pretty much everything, because George is a wealth of knowledge and his wit is simply amazing. George, all comfortable and ready to go?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Okay then, the first question we had is from Lua.
Okay, George, I'd like you to begin, if you can give us some of the history of your relationship with Cliff High and the WebBot, and tell us how that relationship has changed your perception of world events.
Well, it's really been an eye-opener, and it started back in, well, let me back up. First, how Cliff became aware of my work. In 1997, I was finishing up a master's in business administration, and I needed a capstone project. And a capstone project is like how one supposedly applies all of this vast learning in school. And I had become totally fascinated with this weird little corner of economics called long wave economics. Essentially, what long wave economics posits is that there are occurrences that befall a secular economy, irregardless of the socioeconomic platform it's on. In other words, such things happened during the French Revolution, as well as during the American Civil War, as well as during periods of peace, during great wars, great depressions, and so forth. There are these ups and downs to the economy. So I had started writing this rather interesting topic and trying to relate daily news events to what was occurring in the long wave economic picture. And in about May or so of 2001, I began corresponding with a reader of the urbansurvival.com website who initially referred to himself only as the think tank. And we developed a correspondent relationship, and he had some extremely insightful things to say about what he foresaw would be happening to the world. What made it so interesting was that it made sense in terms of the long wave economic predictions, which are, by the way, that we're in the process either of entering or now some distance into a grand supercycle economic depression. This despite all of the protestations out of Washington to the contrary. And so we began exchanging notes, and he revealed that he had been using a new technology which he had developed, which essentially assigned numeric values to words. These numeric values allowed for words to be processed very much as one would process a mathematic problem. And it wasn't necessarily the word frequency. That kind of thing was already well established at that time. But using a program called Prolog, stitched together with Perl, C++, and other computer languages that Cliff is very competent in, extremely so, he was able to provide some contextual basis for what coming events should look like. That led in, I would say, about first week of July of 2001 to me posting a piece on the urbansurvival.com website, which, by the way, you can still find there, in which he posited that the world will be at a tipping point within usually 45 to 60 days of this big linguistic blip that he had noticed in the early iterations of the WebBot project. So along ticks the calendar. Initially going into it, I thought it would be the U.S. unilateral abrogation of the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty with the Russians, simply because that was such a hot item in headlines of the day. As it turns out, however, the linguistics were pointing at correctly an event with shades of military, shades of accident, and the geographic descriptors we had at the time included the Philippines as well as Las Vegas. Naturally, I woke up the morning of 9/11 on my sailboat in San Francisco. The wife and I had just gotten up and were kind of watching television, CNN, in the aft stateroom and having coffee. And all of a sudden, we're watching the Twin Towers go down. And I looked at Elaine and said, oh, my God, this is exactly what the think tank guy up in the Northwest was talking about when he said a tipping point after which life would never be the same as we've known it up until now. So at that point, the credibility was instantly established. He then went on to share some of his other work, the Vortex Reader, which I don't know if he talked about when he was on with you folks, but it's a system that takes a text file and allows you to view that text file flickering individual words before your eyes, and it allows you to almost instantly quadruple your reading speed. I don't use it as much as I used to because it's become somewhat stressful knowing a little too much about the future before it gets here. But that's really where things began. Then shortly after that, he said, well, we're going to have an attack on House or Assembly. And then immediately thereafter, we have the anthrax attack. And the hits just keep on coming, as no doubt this group is pretty well aware. Did that cover it?
Yes, George?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Lord.
How has it changed your perception of world events in the ongoing period of time between 2001 and now for your ongoing relationship?
Well, our ongoing relationship is still great. We don't talk as often as we did during the earlier days of the project. I think Cliff has the technology tuned as well as a one-man software project can get. Sure, it would be nice to, have somebody come throw $100 million at the problem and say, hey, could you take it to the next level? But I'm not sure the world is really ready for too much knowledge of the future. The other thing that's become very apparent, and Cliff and I are very much synced up on this, I think, is that there's really almost like two worlds out there. One of the worlds out there is obviously the one you see in the headlines, where everything goes along bumping in a semi-accidental fashion. But after you get exposed to a little bit of knowledge of the future in advance, get to following some of the what we now call the powers that were, although I still refer to them as the powers that be, you can see that there's really a separate layer of power and influence that determines the course of human events to a much larger degree than people might otherwise appreciate. This is not to say that we entirely agree on all aspects of how the powers that be operate. I have been pretty much the journeyman reporter and junior time monk but every once in a while, I make contact with people I know run with the powers that be, and it becomes very obvious that their timing and Cliff's timing on many of the world events are pretty similar. For example, we've got a period of building tension that we'll be getting into come March 23rd. It's my understanding from talking to one of my sources that alleges himself to run in the powers that be kind of circles, that we will see a major upturn in Middle Eastern pressure, particularly against the large oil countries, along toward the end of April, perhaps into May. And it doesn't take too much of a rocket scientist to figure out that $6, $7, $8 gasoline is likely in the cards this summer. It doesn't take too much of a genius to figure out that there is a major decline underway in the U.S. standard of living, and that the powers that be have taken to exploiting people who will work a lot cheaper than Americans will in other parts of the world. I try to remain non-value judgmental about how this stuff all works out, but clearly the powers that be are a group, or numerous groups actually, that just like corporations have interlocking boards of directors so that corporate decisions can be orchestrated together, so too the powers that be, and I don't want to say run the world that way, but they really do. So I look forward to, say, May, the beginning of the real serious push toward $200 per barrel oil. And, of course, that ties right in with increased tensions in the Middle East. And all of that, of course, is pretty neatly laid out in Cliff's work, as well as the extreme social disruption that may come as humans respond to being backed into a corner and being, I guess, more and more placed under control of a socioeconomic system, which is in the process of dividing back into a very clear form of dualism. Just a footnote, we've seen dualism come and go over the course of history. Usually it involves some kind of a war. Most recently, of course, was the 1917 through 1989 wall coming down period, which was our long-running war and very profitable for the powers that be, involving the Soviet Union, which was really not complete till about 1991 or so. The difficulty with dualism is it's a wonderful engine of economic growth on both sides. It did serve to move the Soviet Union ahead, and at the same time, it kept the American workers' nose down on the grindstone. So when you talk about how has this all changed my view of world affairs, it is now evident post 9/11 that we're in another case of what appears to be the setting up of a dualism or a duality between a Western world and an Islamic world. And again, I'm pretty confident the powers that be are going to find ways to make a buck off both sides, as they did in the last big duality, which was communism versus free enterprise. How's that for a big one to wrap your head around?
Oh, yeah, thank you, George. Thanks for that. Many of the Roundtable and Forum members are subscribers of Peoplenomics and are really long-time readers of Cliff. So a lot of areas and topics you touched there we're definitely going to get into. The next question we had was from Chuck.
Hello, George.
Hi, Chuck. How you doing?
Doing fine. I've got a question. Most of my questions are centered around markets, since they seem to be the topic of conversation. I got a question. Do you believe that the markets are fixed and manipulated to prop them up, as an indicated by the hidden plunge protection team stoppages and purchases, which I'm sure you're aware of. Also, do you have plans to cash out when you deem the market has become too volatile?
Yeah, I guess I need to take that as a couple of different pieces. The first piece has to do with, are the markets manipulated? The answer there is yes, no, yes, no. and let me explain. At the absolute grandest level, one could argue the markets are not manipulated. The markets are not manipulated because at some level there is still an auction process that sets the price of securities. However, when you move into the next layer of the onion, of course the markets are manipulated by the big position players on the one hand, as well as the interested parties on the other. The interested parties being those institutions that used to be the made-to-market in this security guise. So one could say when you get into that next layer, yeah, there is some manipulation of price that occurs. But moving in another layer, R.N. Elliott of the Elliott wave correctly noted that markets seem to move in fairly regular advances and declines, which are either impulsive or corrective in nature, and that these are somewhat predictable. There are only a handful of impulsive moves which a student of the market needs to study. But as my friend Robin Landry, who's a first-rate technical analyst using Elliott notes, it's those 13 different corrective patterns and knowing how they tip their hand that can take a person, in Robin's case, 37 years of study to try and figure out. So at that layer, the markets may or may not be manipulated, depending on if you understand how wave theory works. Bob Prechter's website, elliottwave.com, is an excellent resource. And I've got huge respect for Bob because of the numerous books he set up, as well as his Socionomics Foundation, socionomics.com. And he gets into the application of Elliott wave theory, not just in the markets, but also on the broader socioeconomic spectrum. But then we get back to, yes, then what about all those trading houses that bought the online brokerage firms and installed between the online brokerage and the otherwise auction market? What about the guys that installed a layer of trade ahead of you ultra-fast computers, which are the high-frequency trading platforms? Now, the high-frequency trading platforms arguably are taking everybody, not to the cleaners, but they're hurting all the market participants a fraction of a penny at a time. And so in that sense, yes, that part of the market may be rigged. But stepping back from that, the independent day trader like myself can use a series of charts in Elliott and sort of see where things are going and just understand that you won't get entirely a free market price. There may be, perhaps a fraction of a penny a share that's built into it for the high-frequency traders who are going to front-run markets. So now we're back at, no, it's not really, because I can play the market. But now going back to, yes, it is manipulated. Yes, it is, because both Alan Greenspan as well as Ben the Bernanke have caused me a lot of personal loss in my trading account by intervening at the market without saying well in advance when they're going to intervene. And so, yes, QE2 hurt me as much as QE1 hurt me. And then there were the the Greenspan intervention movements with rates and policies, which were also not extremely well telegraphed the day in advance. So, yes, at that level, the markets are manipulated. Now, let me pause at this layer. I mean, we've got several layers inside of the onion. But at this layer, it's important to note that the Federal Reserve is neither federal nor does it have any reserves. What it does is it orders paper from the mint with a bunch of zeros on it, ones and zeros, and they seem to be happy with the occasional fives, twos, and so forth. So the reason that the Fed does what it does is that the Fed's job is to maintain economic stability. Now, imagine we're all on the Titanic and we've hit the iceberg as we started hitting the iceberg in the fall of 2001, which very obviously to any long-term market student was the all-time high of the Dow with the asterisk on an inflation-adjusted basis. In other words, yes, the Dow went up to 14,000 and change in 2007, but if you correct that 14,000 odd high for inflation, it really undershot where the inflation corrected market was by that period. It should have been over 15,000 to be a new high, but it was not. It was simply a very large Elliott wave one down, and the housing bubble, as well as the multiple wars that were triggered, constituted wave two up in a long wave economic perspective. And now we have seen wave three down begin when we started falling apart. You'll remember Cliff's predictions about October 2008, with the market finally bottoming on an inflation-adjusted basis in April of 2009.
Yep, we did.
And so what we saw there was we saw the beginning of a little bounce that we're in right now, which by my work may very well have topped out at the 12,400 kind of range. We just completed wave one down, a little wave one down, and we're now doing a little corrective move, which appears, and I'm not giving financial advice, but it appears to have completed what would be this little beginning of the bigger move down last, Thursday. And so Thursday I went short using an ETF, an exchange-traded fund, expecting that between now and when Cliff's predicted tension build begins around March 23, that we could have a very rapid decline of the market down to the 11,750 layer. What I then expect would be a move back up of the market to sometime in April, and then a major move down beginning around the 1st of May, maybe a week or so either side, and then a major move down, which could go as low as the 2009 low of Dow 6,600. And that would occur with the latest edition of Summer of Hell, the currency problems, the scarcity of oil, the famine, the food failures, and the general progress of global rev. So now at that point, where we stopped as we went further into the onion was, yes, that's rigged. There's an interesting philosophical question that we need to address. The philosophical question is, if you were a powers that be member, you can write all kinds of conspiratorial scripts about the Bohemian Groves and the Davos and the World Economic Forum and all that kind of stuff. But the philosophical question is it right for the Federal Reserve to inject large amounts of liquidity in order to stave off a greater economic depression, which could bring down the entire world? I don't think I need to go into too much discussion of what the Herstatt principle is, but in 1974, the world had a near brush with the financial end of life on Earth when a little bank in Europe, Herstatt Bank, it was either Austria or Germany, Bankhaus Herstatt was involved in derivatives. And derivatives right now are a $234 trillion floating crapshoot that can literally bankrupt the entire world. Back then, it was only, less than $1 trillion, but it still would have ended financial life on Earth.
I think it's probably over 1 quadrillion, I believe.
The Office of the Comptroller of Currency Numbers, the one I use, which is 234 trillion. And now that's only U.S. That's the U.S. book. So it's very possibly a quadrillion when you get other countries' money, China, Russia, and so forth. So I don't doubt the number. But my point is that philosophically, if you could print money and postpone that day of reckoning, would that be the right thing to do? And then we already know how the Fed's answered that. The Fed, as well as Congress, has answered, oh, hell yes, it's the right thing to do, because if we don't do that, we're going to see global rev in America, which could change out our system of government, which the powers that be find very useful because it allows for a certain bid auction process on a legislative basis, and the powers that be work that just, like it's a finely tuned instrument. If anything, Cliff's work has made me, as if it were possible, even more cynical about economics than I was previously.
Okay. George, just a quick follow-up.
Let me just explain that I don't mean this to be a long and drawn-out description, but when you ask the question about manipulation and control, there's a symbiotic death dance kind of thing here, and as long as the system can be propped up, it's obviously in the interests of the powers that be to keep it propped up as long as they can, because if it goes down, the whole world gets reset to something probably akin to 1920, 1935, someplace in there. And if the electric grid goes down, then we're all in the 1800s, which is why, as Peoplenomics readers know, I've installed 3.6 kilowatts of solar panels and sine wave generators. And yeah, it's all protected from sunshots and sun disease with the best transient protection I can design for it. So, it's a very difficult problem, and what I would urge anybody to do who's got the wherewithal to do so is to be prepared and continue a course of becoming more and more self-reliant, because by becoming more and more self-reliant, you can insulate yourself a little bit from some of these worst-case outcomes. Clearly, the dollar, which is now worth about 4.5 cents, compared with its starting purchasing power in 1913, before the income tax, before the Fed, clearly it's been well hollowed out, losing something like 95% of its value. However, could it lose half of its value again, which would, by the way, double the price of silver, double the price of gold, double the price of gas, double the price of food? And may that happen? Most assuredly it could. And so the real question is, how do you hedge that? And my answer, as well as Cliff's, is you get real independent to the best of your ability, and make yourself system independent, physically hard, mentally tough, and gain all the knowledge you can.
Thank you for that, George. And I think you've just answered every single forum question that we have to ask you tonight when you go home.
I'm sorry about the long answers. But,
That's okay.
Cliff and I are burdened with this, trying to give a complete picture. And when you start talking about things like market manipulation, by God, it really is an onion. And it's really got a lot of different layers to that onion. And the same thing is true of the powers that be. Now, did the powers that be know that they had set in force a massive global deflationary pressure with the unleashing of the internet? Don't know the answer to that. I suppose that they probably did. And did the powers that be make a crap load of money with the internet bubble? Hell yes. Did that create a lot of growth in the world? Yes. But one could argue that economic stimuli like the internet at some level become disruptive to such a major extent that it becomes in the interest of the powers that be to shut them down, which is why the powers that be quietly are getting ready to shove money, I hear, it is alleged to me, to outfits like the Muslim Brotherhood through offshore channels in order to foment more of this dualism so that they can keep a grip on what's quickly turning into a loosening grip on chaos.
Okay. Thanks. I guess we're going to dissect each of those onion layers as we go through these questions. Romans, what's your question?
Hi, George. This is Romans 8:28 is true, but they call me Romans for short. It's
my pleasure.
It's a real pleasure to talk to you. By the way, I read your Urban Survival site every day, and I just renewed my Peoplenomics subscription, so it's be my second year with you.
I appreciate that.
Anyway, my first question is this. What do you think will be the real catalyst to cause the financial and investment markets to become irrelevant in our daily lives?
Oh, boy. That's a darned hard one. You could have asked me an easier one. More than anything, Roman, I think it will be an accident. The powers that be are at the moment, from what I hear, split into two factions, and they're both trying. They both sort of are coming to the realization that global rev is a real deal. Their problem is that there are some minor differences on how they want to ride the wild bull while it works itself out. On the other hand, as soon as we cross one of probably 7 different tripwires or threshold layers, then we'll find we're suddenly at the point where the whole economic system is irrelevant. And there are separate tripwires, Roman, for each of those, what I call the 7 major functional areas of life, which are food, shelter, communications, transportation, energy, finance, and environment. So, for example, in the environment, we would expect that one to not be the tripwire this time around. It was set to be a well-orchestrated plan of the powers that be with a great global warming charade, or charade, depending on which coast you're from. Unfortunately, though, it's now clear from reading the solar data that we have entered a period of a cooler sun, less solar output, and even though cycle 24 is on its way up, and yes, it's going to be big enough to provide us with a Carrington event, and yes, Daryl's comments to the group here a couple of weeks ago about the sun twisting up and turning into an angry sun very well could be spot on. It was not something that could be as easily manipulated by the powers. So I'm not terribly worried about the environment tripwire. The food tripwire, on the other hand, oh my goodness, there we have a huge tripwire, and we've already seen it get out of control with the flooding in Australia, the flooding in South America, as well as in South Africa. So we're going to have some serious food shortfalls in the very near future, and because even this weekend it's still cold in the upper Midwest, when all of the cold weather extends into spring and then we get an unseasonable amount of thawing up north, that very well could result in the Midwest flooding, and then couple that with a return of what I'm sure you've read in Cliff's report, the weather problems of this spring, which will be like the North American comeuppance to the Australian flooding. At least linguistically, things point in that direction. So that's a tripwire. Food prices get too out of hand. People stop messing around with the politeness of exchange, and they go right to guns and clubs. So there's one tripwire. Money tripwire. If inflation gets too out of hand, crime is already. We're expecting to see crime. Myself and I, some of the people I know, we're expecting to see some increases in crime as gasoline prices get back to that $5, $6, $7, $8 range, and people will be committing crimes really for a multiplicity of reasons, but the number of crimes being committed for survival reasons will be the remarkable part of that tripwire. Monetarily, if the government is forced into a position of adding too many zeros too quickly, or decides to do a currency exchange, such as Mexico did in the 1990s, introducing the Nueve Peso in Mexico. It was either a 10-to-1 or 5-to-1 exchange. Then if people stop or lose their confidence in the U.S. dollar, which is dying anyway, then at that point money becomes irrelevant, as do markets. And we've already got the fuses lit and burning on the housing component. Transportation component, we got close to that tripwire when TSA was first beginning its groping last fall. There was a huge rebellion of public sentiment against that. So you can see, I guess what I'm trying to say, Roman, is that just like there's an onion that tells us at what layers the market is or is not manipulated, so too there's an onion on this tripwire thing. And I think it's going to be, you'll simply wake up one morning and the world will have gone past a tripwire, and whether it's the last foreclosure the system can tolerate, which triggers a massive crime wave, or it's too many zeros, or it's somebody outs the real percentage of gold that's nothing more than tungsten bars covered with gold plate, or if the government decides it needs to seize silver and gold, as it did in the 1930s with proclamations to seize silver and seize gold, or any number of other items. But you can see there's kind of a succession of tripwires around most people's comfortable life that a lot of folks just don't want to talk about.
Thanks a lot, George. I really appreciate your perspective there.
Thanks, George. George, you mentioned about the powers that be, and some of the events that arise are going to be manipulated and some are not natural. Do you think the collapse is going to be manipulated? Because on True News with Rick Wiles about 6 weeks ago, he had two guests which provided info from two independent sources that said we were close to a massive US dollar devaluation in economic collapse. Anthony Robbins, a motivational speaker, late last year put out an urgent warning about a collapse, and so did Lindsay Williams and his insider information. The warnings are now matching what you and Cliff have been forecasting about a collapse of the economic system and death of the dollar. How close are we? March 25, end of April for the summer of hell, October?
It's really hard to call. If I were going to throw a dart at a calendar, I would say July 27th. Let me see if that's even a trading day. Hang on. But I would say sometime in the late July to early August time frame. And the reason I say that is a couple of things. But the first one really comes from my long-term study of markets. And if you really want to look at something scary, in fact, I've got on my list for Peoplenomics tomorrow, you can dig up a day-by-day trading history of major market breaks, both 1929, 1987, 2001, 2002, the flash crash a couple of Mays back, there tend to be major market moves about 55 days, trading days, after a significant market peak. And so if February or I forget if it's February or January, my charts blur in my head if I'm not staring at them, we can assume that the crash will occur 55 days from, let's say, middle of February. And because we could round that off to like 2 months and a week, so that would put us March, April. I would expect the crashing part to begin sometime late April to early May. I'd have to work out the trading days. But remember, Cliff's exactly right forecast about the financial crisis in November of 2008. You'll notice that it took the market another 4 or 5 months to actually work down to its ultimate low. So we might see something, and it should be really tradable too. Not that money means anything at that point, but we might see something like, let's say, my last week of April crash were to occur. Then we would see the market work its way down from there to maybe October or November for an ultimate market low this year. Now, in that period, there's a very good chance that in my work, and this is not in Cliff's, but in mine, we could see something of a serious decline in the price of the precious metals. And the reason for that is that those who have metals positions, when they have to cover their positions in the market, any long positions, they'll sell anything, including the kitchen sink and the important gold and silver. So I think in that time frame, we could easily see a drawback. The difficulty, though, from an investor's perspective, is someplace in here when that next leg down of deflation arrives and hits the market. The government's going to have to do something huge to try and stimulate markets. And that's where we get into serious hyperinflation. The hyperinflation I anticipate would be on the order of 10 times, so that we would likely at that point see the price of gold going from maybe we'll get up to 2,000 or so this run. We might drop back to 1,000-ish or under at the absolute height of the financial panic. But then when the government comes along and announces financial austerity programs, it would then try to call gold at a relatively low price, but at the same time would institute economic policies that would be incredibly inflationary. And so that's a nice way of repudiating the large fraction of debt. At this point, the U.S. has about 62% of GDP, which is labeled as debt, but a 10-to-1 reduction of the debt through pernicious inflation would drop that down under 10%. Now, the problem with doing that is China and the other massive holders of U.S. debt are going to go ballistic and possibly go ballistic when they figure out that we're screwing them over. But is China ready to take on the U.S. in a war this year or next? I don't think so. I think it's still premature. So I think that's a kind of how it could all work out. And curiously, Lindsey Williams' information about the plans of the powers that be to redevelop the U.S. petroleum industry at $200 oil is incredibly credible, since my powers that be source is telling me the same thing with a little bit more detail as far as how it will occur and how the Gulf of Mexico assets are presently in the process of being scooped up at relatively inexpensive prices compared to their future potential worth.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Lua.
Yeah, George, I'm hearing you say that the possibility there's a collapse in April or May, and then it continues to get worse throughout the summer to next fall, and then the government does things to balance it back up and try to bring it back in again. What I'd like to know is, do you see a time in the future when you will no longer give advice to people about how to make money by playing the markets, as opposed to giving up on the investment in the money industry completely and spending every penny of their income on the acquisition of hard goods, such as, food, tools, medical supplies, shelter, water, that kind of thing, to help them weather the changes in our planet, and following that, if they have money left over, the purchase of physical gold or silver?
That's a very reasonable strategy. I believe that there will always be opportunities to make paper money until the exchanges close down. When the exchanges close down, then paper money at that point is worthless. At this point, the amount of money that I have in the stock market would not buy you a new car. The amount of money I have in precious metals, in stored foods, in gun and ammunition, in medical supplies, in health, in tools for my shop, spare parts for our tractor, dwarfs anything that I've got in the paper markets. The paper markets, unfortunately, are continuing to be important to people, not necessarily as a place to go play money, Lua, but a place where many people see this as the only place where they can try to preserve something against the future outside of, the pantry, because a lot of people don't own their own home. A lot of people don't have the luxury of moving to a small city where they can actually afford to buy and get paid for real estate inexpensively. So will there be a point at which I simply say the discussion on peoplenomics and urban survival will become less and less market-oriented? Of course. Will it become someday entirely monetary-free or not discussing money? Yeah, probably. But even so, there's going to be the whole problem of how do you weigh silver? How do you test silver? What are comparative silver prices and silver to goods comparable prices in other parts of the country? I think long before that the country gets to that kind of level, I think the internet will be taken down because it's so threatening to the existing powers that be, and to an extent the political system. And even if the internet is not taken down, rotating blackouts could effectively do the same thing, turning off large sections of the internet. A long answer, and I'm sorry if I can't be more precise, but someday I don't expect to mention markets ever.
You're being a wealth of information, believe me, so I'm appreciating the long answers. Years ago, when I was learning about the stock market, it was explained to me that people investing, what they did was they bought shares that would subsequently pay them a portion of profits from the company that they had shares in. But today, the buying and selling of stock doesn't seem to actually have anything at all to do with the products produced in companies. It's rather traded among investors, with the shares themselves being the profit or the loss factor. And how do you feel about this change in the premise of trading on the stock exchange?
I think it's crooked as hell, quite frankly. But
Okay.
but that doesn't mean that I won't play that. For example, look at, there are people that buy things that claim to be silver ETFs. And yet when I read a prospectus on it, on one of the leading one of the leading metals ETFs, I didn't see where they actually were going to hold any physical metal. They were simply promising a return equal to a particular index of metals. And so to me, people, number one, don't read prospectuses. Number two, companies are not returning dividends to shareholders, which is how Microsoft got to be so big through retained earnings. Now, the company does pay something of a dividend last time I looked, but the whole history of the stock market is that it is continually being virtualized. And when I say being virtualized, there was a time when a share, as you correctly note, helped a company buy a plant, and the profits from the operation of that plant were paid out as dividends. Well, ain't no such thing for most companies now, and the stock market would already have crashed if we had not removed outfits like AIG and others from the indices at key moments. And so a long-term view of the stock market and how the stock game is played always has to be tuned a little bit to take into account delisted stocks and companies that have gone bankrupt. Take WorldCom, for example. Whenever you get a list of companies that have been delisted from the NYSE and you ask your broker, well, take out these newcomer stocks that are on the rise and put back in these old guys that went bankrupt and or got delisted as being in one of the Dow 30, and now tell me how the Dow's really doing. Those substitutions have become just a matter of life, and if you had invested in Studebaker, once a fine company, you'd be dead ass broke today. So the rules change over time, and even though some guys like Warren Buffett claim to not like derivatives, you go read the financial on Berkshire and, oh, look, they own derivatives too. So the problem with derivatives, of course, is that's interest on interest. And anytime interest on interest begins compounding, you know you're in a crooked casino. You know the casino is going to take all the suckers' money. But most people like my age, I'm 62, have not looked at the problem head on and instead believed that they would be able to get a retirement program. You'd have a great retirement program if you had gone into silver and gold at the market high in 2000, but I can't name one person out of anybody else I know besides me who did that.
I'd like to ask you, how in the world did they get away with removing those companies from the indices? It sounds to me just like the game that the feds play when they remove the energy and the food costs from the cost of living. So how did they do that?
Oh, it's very simple. They just wake up one day and say, well, we're going to do this now. Let me give you two. I mean, that's just what they do. It's their index, and they can do what they damn well feel like with it.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, in fact, let me pop open a Wikipedia window real quick. Wikipedia, if you go there, has a listing of when stocks were added and when stocks, I think they've got when stocks were taken out. No, I guess they don't have the delisted ones. But you can see that some companies like 3M and so forth, Alcoa, they've been around for a good long while. But you look at some of the more recent stocks that were added to the Dow, like Travelers Insurance in 2009, I think that's the one that replaced AIG. Now, if you sit back, Lua, and look at these things, you'll begin to go, wait a minute, how the heck can they do that? Well, it's very simple. It's their casino. They can do what they damn well want, and most people do not pay close enough attention to the purchasing power of their money over time. And if you pay attention not to the monthly consumer price index, and you pay only attention to the very long term, you'll find that on average since 1913, your dollar has lost 2.3% of its purchasing power per year since then. Now, there's no reason why that cannot be continued for the foreseeable future until a lot of the baby boomers wake up and start getting on board with a global rev concept and go, wait a minute, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I had a house, a little cabin at the lake, and I went on a cruise twice a year, and now I'm barely hanging on to my house. My job has been half outsourced to India, and people are not aware that this job jacking phenomenon, the virtual invasion of the United States, has hollowed out America to the point where it's no longer the great country it once was. Is it a great country? Yes. Is there anything better? No. Am I going to stick around? Hell yes. It's still my country, 'tis of thee. But my country, 'tis of thee, sit on my wallet because I know what the game is, and the game is take 2% of my real power away from me every year. So when I get a little money ahead, I buy a tractor. I buy something that can create wealth. I buy a tool for my shop which can create wealth, not absorb wealth. And so that, and like I just bought a greenhouse a couple of months back. Not a real big greenhouse, but I expect that over the next 5 years, that greenhouse will pay for itself many, many times over in saving me the cost of buying inflated food. And that's the key thing about Peoplenomics. We've had a lot of discussion on the Peoplenomics site about the non-monetary economics of life. The non-monetary economics of life is you need 2,000 calories and you need a gallon of water and you need a roof over your head and you need warm clothing or heat if you're north of 40. So what you're going to do, you can get that a couple of different ways. One way is save a whole lot of money and buy a house, or alternatively save 1/3 of the money and build your own damn house. See, people are lazy. People want to sit in front of their televisions. They look to guys like Cliff and me and, Salente and the others. They look for simple answers because the rest might involve sweat, might involve getting off the ass and doing some real work. Well, see, those kind of people, I hate to say it, but those are the fluoride-laced folks who are going to be the ones out rioting in the street when they don't get their freebies. And next thing that happens, the powers that be will send in their agent provocateurs, as they have done so many times, to sort of lead the revolution the way they want it to go. And that's what the powers did with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, no problem.
Groundrod, you've got a question for George.
Yeah, hi, George. It's an honor to talk with you. You mentioned November '08. I think it was October 8th, 2008.
I'm sorry. Yes. I'm sorry. Bad memory cell.
Well, I think it was you and Cliff I heard on Coast in September that blew my mind when that happened. And
well, the old saying, Groundrod, is the future does not arrive unannounced. The powers that be are getting ready for it. The language is already shifting. Cliff's just got a genius level way of figuring out the language. And when I couple what I know about markets and what he knows about linguistics, it obviously is headed down this track this summer. And another guy who puts the future together very well is Gerald Salente. I think a lot of him. I think a lot of Stansberry. I think a lot of Stratfor. I mean, there's a lot of places that have credible outlooks about the future. But again, the average couch potato Groundrod's going to sit there on his ass and, watch American Idol and, where'd all this come from?
Yeah, I stopped watching TV in I think '05, and just really got interested in being prepared, especially in '06. But I'm just going to ask a question from another forum member here today. This is from Five Cook. I have been interested in preparedness since the '80s and Howard Ruff, you have been predicting inflation, deflation, and stagflation for many years, but say that the powers that were have successfully delayed such by various bubbles in the economy, including the dot-com bubble in the 90s and the war on terror in the 2000s. Will they successfully delay the crash again, and what will be the next bubble, World War III, or have things progressed too far for a bubble to rescue us?
No, I don't think we've gone too far. By the way, you mentioned one of my favorite people. I first met Howard Ruff when I was news director of KOL, or was it KMPS at that point? I think it was in late 70s. I met Howard. He's a delightful guy, and his newsletter, the Ruff Times, is really very good. I think he's still out in Utah, and I think he was the guy who first got me to thinking about buying pre-64 silver rounds when they could be had. Bags of junk silver, you're going to barf when you hear this, bags of junk silver back then were going for $4 and $5 an ounce, and it was ridiculous. I know people that have 20,000 ounces of silver, and they don't think they have enough. And I'm going, oh my God, you've got some serious coins there. Anyway, the question I think that we all need to ask is, what will be the next tool to get us a continuation of the bubble? I think there is an extremely high risk once we get into the August-September timeframe that we could have a, quote, terrorist, unquote, attack on U.S. soil. The reason for that is when I look, and I have it on the Urban Survival site every week, that little chart down at the bottom that shows that the events of 9/11 occurred at almost precisely the point that without 9/11, the public would have awakened to the fact that a second depression is here. As things stand, I think that a $200 price of oil, a, quote, foreign terrorist attack using some kind of weapon of mass destruction on American soil, even though it will almost assuredly be funded by minions of the powers that be through offshore banking routes that are beyond the inspection of U.S. regulatory agencies, I expect that that would be timed to occur to provide for Patriot Act 3 or 4, or whatever we're up to now, giving the government an excuse to further stifle dissent, to really push forward censorship of the Internet, and to simultaneously build credibility for the emerging side of the new dualism, which will be the West versus the Islamic East. And I think part and parcel of that will have China cast in the role of part and parcel of the Islamic East, and therefore it will be the West versus China and its allies. And so I think that's really the game setup for this fall. That's my worst fear, because at a very core level that would fulfill a lot of linguistics, but also at a very core level, it would be a big enough emotional shocker to give the powers that be the kind of control they'd need to institute another leg up. And so whether that occurs or not remains to be seen, but my confidence in that scenario, as terrible as it is, if we see a large uptick in attacks on Middle East oil transshipment points late April to mid-May, then my confidence that the terrorism card will be played becomes very high for later in the year. There are people out there who are totally amoral when it comes to money, and one of the more popular Wall Street axioms is your money doesn't know where it came from. And unfortunately, that's an epidemic of absent morality here on the planet. And the other sad fact of things is that in order for the powers that be to remain powers, they have to have a decent-sized slave class or worker bee class to give them the adulation and the admiration that they so seek after. So, and they in return view themselves as shepherds of their own flock. So it's a very complex, twisted game that goes on. And unfortunately, while it's possible today for every person on the planet to be well fed and well cared for, and each of us would only have to work an hour or two, maybe 3 per day to accomplish that, there's not profit and there's not position power. And one of the things you learn in management school is about the different flavors of power. There's raw economic power, there's position power, there's social power, etc. And so the powers that be are not interested just in money. They're also interested in controlling the masses to maintain their own flow of the various flavors of power that they like to accrue.
Thank you, George.
Weird answer, eh, Ground Rod?
No, it's a lot to digest.
Oh, sorry. I've been dieting, so and since I've been dieting, I have been doing way more digesting, it seems. That was a joke.
Someone that's survived following half past human as long as you have is it's just amazing. Thank you for everything you do.
I don't claim to have any particular knowledge of the future. Only that history seems to rhyme, and there's a bunch of players that are very skillful in rising to the top, and Cliff's work certainly gives some indications well in advance of some of these turning points. I maintain that Cliff got the turning point in November exactly right, because that's when the grassroots build to the revolution in Egypt got underway, and yet I'm sure there are going to be people who say, well, you guys were 8 weeks early, and it didn't really happen until January, and now all the fast food people are talking about global rev in the Middle East blowing up and yada, 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 but you guys didn't get it because you were 8 weeks early. And really the answer is, we were also 8 weeks early on 9/11 too. What can I say? So sorry. But when you hit the tipping point, the actual tip can occur, and then events roll forward until you get to the point of public recognition. Just like when we were talking about the tipping point stuff in 2001 with the Al-Qaeda guys and had the little cloud over Las Vegas on my map. At any rate, I think we should probably move on to the next question.
Okay. Thanks, George. George, again, for listeners, George's site is urbansurvival.com. We're going into the precious metals now. George, one of the areas of differences between yourself and Cliff is the market behavior. With the silver and gold exchange prices rising this week, I think it hit $35 this week, and with the US stock market also rising, do you still expect a massive Dow correction back to its 6,700 lows, or, as Cliff thinks, will the market melt up so it goes to its all-time high of 14,000, as it is propped up by the Fed, while hyperinflation increases the prices of precious metals, food, and energy? In short, based on your economic experience, a melt up or melt down?
Well, the two views, Jules, are not mutually exclusive. From a pure chart standpoint, we could easily go back down to 66.27 Dow on a weekly closing basis. On the other hand, as I mentioned, I believe that when deflation becomes widely recognized, if in fact we get there, then I think the Fed will have no choice but to implement a currency revaluation on probably a 10-to-1 basis. On a 10-to-1 basis, if you had $10,000 of cash, you would now have $100,000. But what would happen to existing contracts that did not have any provision in them for revaluation of the currency? Things could get so ugly so fast, and yet it would be a convenient way to give people a lot of money fast and get it out into circulation. Give you an example. Say Groundrod bought a house. Groundrod bought a house for $200,000, maybe at the peak of the bubble, 2008. Bad move, Groundrod. The house is now worth $100,000, and Groundrod is making $50,000 a year. With a revaluation, and they'll by the way, they'll use the word revaluation, not devaluation, and they'll do that to sell it, just like they use consumer debt is a bad thing. So they call it consumer credit because they're looking at it from their standpoint all the time. Anyway, and they're issuing us credits to borrow money from them. Anyway, so here's Groundrod. He's got $50,000 a year of income, and he's got a $100,000 debt on this house. With a revaluation, if the underlying contractual value is not adjusted, he'll still have $100,000 in value, but he'll have an annual income of not $50,000, but $500,000 going forward. So first thing you know, Groundrod really is going to end up owning his house. So in some ways, a revaluation could work out in favor of certain classes of people. Now, where it isn't going to help anybody would be a revaluation without rent control, because a landlord would quickly realize that the tenant that was making $3,000 a month now makes $30,000 a month. And so any revaluation scheme would have to be accompanied by either wage and price controls or certainly rent controls in order to keep people from overnight being priced out of housing. It's still something to think about. Same thing is true with gold and silver. Gold in a 10-to-1 right now would be at $14,000 per ounce, well within Cliff's linguistic outline for what's ahead. And silver would be at $350, but because there may not be enough physical silver in the vaults to cover worldwide demand, if too many people start taking delivery, and there are moves afoot to do that, we could easily see $150 silver, and $150 silver times 10 in a revaluation becomes $1,500 silver. Of course, at the same time, gasoline would go from $6 a gallon to $60 a gallon, but oh well, that's just how things would work out. Long answer, but we could easily hit both of those expectation sets. And we might not hit mine, we might not hit his, but he's just reporting what's in there in the language.
Thanks, George. Kat, you got a question for George?
Yes. Hello, George.
Yes, ma'am.
I have been every morning sitting there with Urban Survival with my cup of Java. Thank you so much, and I'm also Peoplenomics subscriber. I've got a question from Party Pup.
Okay.
Watching the pattern of metals action closely over the past year, it appears that while silver has decoupled from gold, and while it has outperformed gold in the last 6 months, it is clearly still a ways from its 1980 non-inflation adjusted high of $49.95 an ounce. While gold has nearly doubled its 1980 non-inflation adjusted high of $850 an ounce. Although Cliff has been predicting $5 days in silver, many wonder whether silver's ascent is being held back by gold, the more political and monetarily significant metal, which must rise along with silver. So, in your opinion, A, how high will we see silver get before we hit the $2,000 gold tipping point? And B, since silver is still an industrial metal, is there a price at which you believe it makes sense to unload silver and redirect assets into gold, which has historically been much less volatile? Or will silver be a reliable form of wealth protection as long as wealth matters? It's a long one.
Yeah, I don't know if my brain can handle all of it. The short answer is I believe that the powers that be probably have a much lower pain threshold on gold than $2,000 per ounce. I believe that there may be enough derivatives tied to gold in different currency transactions, particularly in the international arena, that I would not be surprised if the powers that be don't have a threshold much lower at, say, the $1,700 level. Don't get me wrong. I mean, that's still a nice little pop from where we are today, but I'd be surprised to see gold much over 1,600 by the end of the year. Not saying that we would necessarily not go to 2,000 in a short term, but my expectation would be that we'll maybe go up through this April secondary bounce thing after we go down and test the 11,750. But I would expect that we'd then see gold come down to around 1,000. And it's possible. Now this is just an outlier possibility. But remember, in Cliff's work, it's very hard to pull directional calls. So silver could have a $5 day, but it could be a $5 downside day. So while I'm optimistic about silver and gold as long-term values, I think that there are some major contractual issues related to what the price of gold has to be at the end of the year when a lot of these contracts reset either on December 31 or January 1, based on interest rates and commodity prices on that date. I think that there would be a lot of problems in the financial system with resets come year end if the commodities are more than, say, 1,800 gold and $50 silver. That's just an expectation. Not saying that they're bad things to buy. If I could find more silver, I'd probably buy some more. But there are also a number of issues related to fraud. I'm sure you've read about the tungsten bars that are covered with gold that supposedly were unloaded from the U.S. to a lot of other countries during the closing days of the Clintonista administration, and that supposedly was carried out through the Bush administration, so that some of our major counterparties may be losing confidence in what they really have, and that might explain why they can still buy our bonds. But whether those bonds include verbiage about revaluation remains unclear. It sounds like a weaselly answer, but I think that $2,000 gold is something that might well happen for either a short term, but I'd be surprised if it lasted long enough to cash in come the end of the year if that was a particular investment horizon. I think that what would really fit would be something like the United States experiencing a domestic terrorism event in response to a declined market, a well-orchestrated rally around the country kind of rally, which would be coupled with this is the financial Pearl Harbor kind of talk, followed by the government trying to buy up gold and silver at some nominal figure, say $1,500 for gold and maybe $40 silver, and declaring it a felony not to do so. Most people forget, everybody remembers that gold was called in the Depression of the 1930s, but a lot of people forget that silver was also called in 34. Granted, nobody went to jail that I know of, but there's also been speculation on the internet that one reason not to own American gold or silver product is that the government could make a case, however flimsy, that those coins are really the property of the U.S. Mint. Just like it's illegal to deface the dollar bill in your wallet, not because it's not a piece of paper that a pen won't work on, but because it's property of the U.S. government. And so a lot of us who invested way early in these commodities made a conscientious decision, conscientious too, to buy only commodity units which were not property of the U.S. government for our long-term hedging position.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much for answering the first question, George. That was awesome. The question that I have, I've heard rumors there's a plan to crash major currencies so the World Bank could offer their SDRs as a solution. If this was to happen, how would we see this scenario being played out? Would it be in stages? And how long would this process last? Could an end scenario be a two-tier currency system for all countries?
I don't think a two-tier currency system would work very well for the pure, simple fact that the Internet gets around everything pretty transparently. It's just too doggone easy to put money in a bank in America and go to a foreign country, find a branch of that American bank and pull it out over there. And by the same token, it's easy to move money into America. The wire transfer systems, that works to a certain extent, but physically going someplace. True, you have to get permission to leave the country, does appear a bit, but it's a little bit difficult. In terms of the IMF or World Bank putting on a special drawing right basket of currency approach and making everybody mark their currency to the basket when it comes to settlement of international debts, don't think that's going to happen because each of the players has their own preferred outcome. It would be like, what flavor of ice cream would it be if you wanted chocolate, I wanted vanilla, Groundrod wants orange sherbet, and Dale wants Pomoni? I mean, it's kind of where we're at. And whatever that combination is, you might be able to call it ice cream, but it would sure be on everybody. So I don't hold a lot of hope for special drawing right unless it were denominated largely in gold. But the problem with that, and the reason the Chinese would probably not go for it, is if there is any basis in fact to the rumors that much of their gold that they got from the West is tungsten and covered in gold.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, Kat, if I can, we're kind of in a box canyon, and I don't know if you've ever watched Westerns, but a box canyon was where wild animals were rounded up into a canyon, which there was only one way out of, and that was through the gauntlet set up by whoever was doing the stampeding. And to a certain extent, the global financial system finds itself in a box canyon today because there's just very little in the way of ways to get out without somebody getting hurt. And what all the players are doing at the moment, they're all throwing in calls from the sidelines to the quarterbacks, and we've got 4 quarterbacks on the field. We've got the Middle East money, we've got the Chinese money, we've got the Russian money, we've got the Europe money, and then we have the U.S. money, and then we have the South American, and then we have the non-aligned. So I guess, arguably, we've got 8 quarterbacks on the field, if I counted that correctly, and everybody wants to run to a different goalpost. Well, that's turning into a pretty ugly football game. And do you remember, I forget which one it was. It was one of Robert Redford's movie. Wasn't Color of Money, but they were playing Tag War. Might have been Butch Cassidy. Anyway, they were playing Tag War, the exciting game without any rules. And it was just a game where you went in, sat down, played cards, and made up rules of the game as you sort of felt like. And you declared the rule, and then everybody had to play with it until they declared a different rule, and then you lost. And that's kind of where the world currency system is right now. Although the Bernanke and the cheering section down at the morgue and the guys at the IMF and the guys at the World Bank would hope that everybody believes there's love, peace, harmony, and that peace and prosperity are immediately around the corner. I got in so much trouble on Friday, by the way, for referring to the internet invasion of cheap overseas labor, not the unions, as being the reason for job losses in America, that had gone to what I called the third world. Boy, I got so many political correct police. Damn, they were just down my throat, dudes. They were like, you can't call it that. We all know it was the banksters that, well, of course we did. But I call it the third world because I sure as hell wouldn't want to go work there, even if you paid me $3 an hour. I'm sorry. I'd just as soon be out here in the middle of the beautiful outback.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, George. Back to the flea world. Dead Poet, you got a question for George?
Yeah, hello, George. Nice to be having some financial pie this morning.
Much pie.
Much pie. It's good pie.
Much to put a thumb in.
Exactly. Cliff seems to think that one of the turning points for the dollar death will be when the U.S. dollar is actually removed as being the petrodollar. And I'm sure you saw the report by Goldman Sachs that stated, along with Libya, if one or more countries like Algeria or another, and that one particularly outputs 1.8 million barrels per day, if that failed, then the NYMEX prices would go to $2.20 a barrel. Now, with Saudi Arabia, next possible target for protests, could this be the mechanism for the world dumping the U.S. dollar as the petrodollar?
Well, I think at that point is when the SDR crowd will stand up and say, see, this is our case for a market basket. We can't just trash the U.S. completely. And what would happen, the happy ending scenario would be the U.S. would slowly be phased out or down to at least parity with other countries of similar GDP to debt ratios, Greece, Ireland. Anyway, as that comes along, the hope would be that it could occur smoothly, but I'm skeptical that it would occur smoothly. And I think I would not disagree with Cliff's read of that at all. As I say, I tend to look at things. I look at the linguistics as a tool to better read markets. Cliff looks at linguistics as a science unto itself, and it's perhaps a little confusing when I'm trying to match it up with existing economic bodies in motion, if you will. Remember how physics works? A body in motion tends to continue in that direction, in that motion, until something comes along and breaks it, right? Well, by the same token, economies work that way. Currencies work that way. Hell, even political systems work that way. They work until they stop working. And so, yes, we could have the catastrophic end. And, yes, you saw where China is moving by the end of this year to only use its yuan for settlement of any international debts. So they're already moving in that direction. Essentially, China is saying, we're only going to recognize the Chinese currency by the end of the year anyway, so y'all might as well get on board with it now. That will put, it almost puts a sunset on how long the dollar can last.
Great. Thank you for the answer to that. We also have another question from a forum member that actually sort of pertains to this. The last time we saw gas above 100 a barrel, or actually oil above 100 a barrel, the official unemployment rate in the U.S. was just a bit under 6%. Oil closed above 102 today, but actually I think this question came in Thursday. It was actually 104. But and the official nationwide unemployment is now 9%. Many analysts suggest that we're now starting that the U.S. and are now stating that the U.S. economy cannot sustain oil at current price levels for any sustained length of time. What is your opinion of A, the maximum length of time that our economy can sustain 100 plus oil, and B, at what price threshold will the economy tip over the edge and thrust urban areas in our country into an Egypt/Libya style unrest?
Oh boy, that's like asking, all the horses have been driven into this box canyon I was talking about, and the cowboys are slowly riding toward the wild horses in the box canyon. At what point does one horse try to make a break for it? Can't tell you. I think that will be one of those discrete, as it happens kinds of things. Is there a peaceful work through? Maybe not. I like to remain optimistic that the muddle through can be pulled off, but to do so, it would require extraordinary moves, which would be extraordinarily controversial. And I think the country is deeply divided now to the point where we cannot get a consensus on much of anything. And so it could well become an inevitable outcome. Sorry. And where it goes to the street is when the standard of living for those already at the margin tips over. I've got 3 kids in their 30s, and all 3 at the moment are back working again. So I know from a personal standpoint, since I operate the National Bank of Dad, that things have improved a little bit in the secular economy. But have they improved enough? No. Are many of the jobs temporary? Yes. Are many of the jobs which will eventually be replaced by least cost workers in India? Yes, as soon as managements can figure out how to rearrange their business models to use cheaper labor, that by God will happen, and then we'll be back in the soup again. See, the problem with a silent invasion is once you go down that road, once you can plug in one person in India who will work for less than half the price of one person in the USA, you've effectively started gutting real productive jobs out of America. And that's been going on for 10 frigging years. What's happened now, we're not reading about revolution in India, but if we were to cut off U.S. business in India and started taxing overseas product at a rate sufficient to pay for our unemployment that results from offshores and job jacks, then India would also go up in flames. So you see the problem, as I say, we're in that box canyon. It's just a matter of the powers that be are all playing this running craps game of how can I win and screw everybody else? And that's where we are right now. We're in that last round of Texas screw 'em everybody.
Thank you, George.
Yes, thank you.
Romans,
thank you very much.
Romans, can you ask a question of George, please?
Yes, George. I have a kind of a 2-pronged question here, and then possibly, depending on your answer, I may have a follow-up. With the mortgage fraud closure situation, kind of still simmering on the back burner. What is your gut feel for how that situation will play out? And just for the listeners, we're referring here to the fact that in many cases the banks and mortgage companies fail to adhere to real estate law and have the appropriate documents updated and recorded, etc. In many cases, the documents were shredded by MERS, which is the Mortgage Electronic Registration System, and are gone forever. So the second part of the question, the first one was your gut feel on how this will all play out. The second part is, do you foresee a time when the majority of homeowners will just stop paying their mortgages as a conscious decision, since it is quite likely that if they pay their house off to the loan company might not be able to supply them a clear title?
Yeah, that's becoming increasingly likely. There's actually action in 2 or 3 different states. One state is Washington State, where the real estate and bank lobby has been running around passing out favors, votes, promises. Let's have dinner and talk about it. No, I mean a really nice dinner, a really nice bottle of wine. We really can turn out a lot of votes for your campaign if you can simply change contract law in Washington State so that the normal requirement in contract law in all other aspects of life, which is the ability to produce a wet signature document, in other words, the original, preferably in blue ink so that you can see that it was actually signed, is gone. The powers that be are desperately trying to get this stuff through because they don't want to have the repudiation of debt. The repudiation of debt is another one of those. Here comes that Box Canyon thing. We've driven all the homeowners in, and we're about to make them all bend over, and we're going to have all their money, and we'll get the house back. But the house back is coming with all of the copper, all of the wire, some of the insulation, all the appliances, and in many cases, not even the carpets are left. So it ain't exactly a desirable repo. I think that will continue on. There was one bank last week that just announced, I think it might have been the morgue, that announced that it was putting a moratorium on foreclosures until there are some key state legislative decisions. But the problem is not going away anytime soon. And if you saw was last week, the figures from the most credible housing numbers out there, I think, are the 20 city numbers off of Standard and Poor's Case-Shiller. If you go to S&P Case Housing Report, you can find it online. You look at that trend, and what you'll see is that, yes, we did some recovery, but now the foreclosure rates are back up, and the number of houses is on the market is such that house prices are back to the 2003 levels, and I would not be surprised at all if we didn't see housing back to the 1998 levels or even the 1970s levels before this is all over with.
George, I've kind of got a follow-up then.
Sure.
Based on your answer there. So with all this situation still kind of brewing and up in the air, what do you think the chances are that the government will end up nationalizing these banks and mortgage companies, and then the homeowners will end up paying their mortgage payments to the government?
Yeah, they already effectively did that in a sense. They already nationalized them when they started giving them my tax money. As far as I'm concerned, now all the banks reportedly have given their TARP money back, but not all of them. There's a few I think that have not paid back yet. But I don't think the federal government should rightly be in the business of making loans on real estate any more than they should be in the business of making loans for student loans. I think that student loans is another area that's likely to blow up because many people go to college and university anticipating, and I was a college president, by the way, so I do speak with a little bit of background here. There's a similar train wreck of debt for all of the young people who, in good faith over the past 10 years, went to vocational and college level post-secondary ed expecting that they would be able to find a meaningful job upon graduation. And now many of these people have got $70, $80, $90,000 of government debt, and it's really owed to the government. And the government is doing things like impounding income tax refunds to get its way and so forth. I think there's a sour enough taste about borrowing money from government that people would not be lining up anytime soon to go out and borrow, be in favor of getting any more entangled at the personal finance level than is already necessary with income taxes and student loans.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate your perspective there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess
Thanks.
let me turn it back and ask. Let me ask you in return. I mean, if you've been screwed over on a student loan, you've lost 4 years running of tax refunds. You're working a minimum wage job, can't find a gig in some profession you've paid a lot of money to be trained in, and now the government wants to screw you over some more. How would you feel about them getting involved in a house that you're maybe barely able to hang on to? I don't think so.
No, I don't think so either. In fact, I'd probably try to start investigating how to change my identity.
A lot of people do that, and really that's what's going on right now. Is there's a battle about the appropriate level of government involvement. Yes, everybody wants to pay taxes to get the fire department or the police department to show up when called. And yes, everybody wants to, I think Garrison Keillor said it in Lake Wobegon, everybody wants to have students in schools that are above average. But the fact of the matter is that at some level, the intrusion of government into our daily lives does become contentious. And I guess I'm one of those people that advocates pay your taxes immediately, do not make payments, just get them out of the way, so that even if you have to live way below your standard of living that you could leverage yourself into, it's a bad deal because I could go out tomorrow and buy a new Mercedes or a new Lexus. We drive, one of our cars is 5 years old and our truck is 10 years old. No, 11 years old. We don't live at our standard of living because we would much rather live below it and be building like an iceberg, something below the waterline, own a shotgun, own a rototiller, own a piece of dirt that is free and clear and the taxes are current on, then you've got something, and that was a lesson from the last depression too. If you owned your property outright, a lot of people could make it through the last depression. And we did. I mean, we got through that as a country. It was a terrible time. And at the end of the depression comes a war. No reason to expect that this version of history won't have a similar outcome, because at some point the whole purpose of a war is to, kill people and destroy production capacity. And if you kill people and destroy production capacity, then you've got a framework which can support future growth. And I know that sounds horrible, but them's is how it is.
Thanks, Georgie, and build demand up. Uranus, you've got a question for George.
Hello, George. How are you?
Well, I'm overworked.
Great.
Go ahead.
Great answers, by the way. It's wonderful. I have a question from a member of the forum, Bluebird. Isn't it time for a new economic model, more like Martin Armstrong's Pi Cycle, where he says that bonds and governments will tank, not stocks and commodities?
Yeah. When somebody says to me a new business model, to me, all businesses have two elements in common. All businesses have the cost of goods sold and the cost of making the goods. That's your top line, and then you've got that's your middle line, and then you've got your profit or your sales, which is your top line. So the only difference in fundamental business models is what happens to any profit or loss. In communism, the assets, the whole model was theoretically owned by the workers. But of course that never actually happened because Russian-style communism was pretty much a Western put-up job anyway, and it was failed when it was appropriate to fail it. The Western for-profit model says that the private company or private corporation is the owner of the sales and of the means of production, the machinery and so plant and equipment, and that any profit should accrue to the corporation, which will then, as it sees fit, distribute those profits out to a number of shareholders. And they may have a couple of different classes of shareholders of different preference, some Class A shareholders, some Class B shareholders, some preferred, and so forth, as well as to bondholders and so on. Now, when Armstrong talks about his model, which I'm not really familiar with, it strikes me that it's almost like the cooperative model, which is where a bunch of cooperating humans owns the sales, owns the means of production, and shares on almost a share basis, as ships used to sail under a shares basis. And they still do in a few industries, like the crab industry in Alaska. Don't know if you know how boat shares work in that, but very, very workable system. The boat gets 2 shares, the captain gets 2 shares, the first mate gets 1 share or 1.5, and so forth. And so things are divided up on a share basis. I think that we will move to that kind of a system over time. Dr. Jack Lessinger, who's a retired professor emeritus from the University of Washington, wrote a wonderful book called The Coming Prosperity of 2020, in which he envisioned something he calls responsible capitalism. I've talked to Jack many times. We are a little different in our interpretation because I think that capitalism has enough seeds of its own destruction from greed and abuse, and I'd hold up Madoff as only the most recent of the examples of this, and also the bankrupting of the countries of Portugal, Greece, Ireland, yada, 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 as other examples. But I think there's enough incentive to do crooked to make money in pure corporate capitalism that responsible capitalism may be really hard to do. But I've written about this a few times, both on Peoplenomics and in Urban Survival. The cooperative business model offers a little bit of hope because the cooperative business model, like Ace Hardware is a good example. Another good example, and it's in the field of healthcare, is Group Health Cooperative up in Seattle. There are a number of cooperatives in healthcare that do extremely well by their patients on average, which is not to say they don't run into ethical issues. Group Health has, like any other healthcare organization, they've got difficult metering of care considerations for very elderly people. My mother lived to be 93, and yet I was actually very happy she had Group Health, a cooperative, providing her insurance to the end. And when it got to the point where she could have had maybe incredibly expensive surgery, which might have bought her a month or two. I was very happy with the hospice approach. She was tired of being old and in pain, and so the cooperative model worked very well in her instance. The problem in the pure corporate model is that those people who can afford to go to a foreign country and buy body parts harvested in South Asia, just as an example, because I know of someone like this, and still ended up passing away. They could do that because they had very deep pockets, and unfortunately, in topics like healthcare, cooperative efforts really make sense. And at its core, I think the Obama administration healthcare model has some validity to it because it attempts to level everybody, lumping those that cannot pay in with those that can afford to buy new body parts on a regular basis, and saying, okay, we're going to try and cost average all this stuff across, and we'll see how that works out. I am skeptical because I think there is so much resistance, going back to what I said earlier about people are already distrustful of the amount of government intrusion into their lives. And are we going to take, at what point does the healthcare, or does the intrusiveness of government into your life become unacceptable? Obviously, it isn't when it comes to schools. It isn't when it comes to pollution controls. It isn't when it comes to income tax. It isn't when it comes to a number of other things, student loans. But when we get into health care, that's starting to get real personal, and that's right in that same league with owing the government a mortgage, which is effectively what happened in the former Soviet Union. They had rents. They didn't get necessarily free housing. And so once again, it's just remonetizing the system, which is why we have a tremendous job ahead of us all if we're to move forward in a world which does not operate in a strictly monetarized way where he who has the gold makes the rules. And unfortunately, that is the world of today. The problem is the gold is unequally distributed. You and I don't have enough. And those that have lots more than all of us combined are not inclined to share it in a meaningful way because they wish to promote what I call the American aristocracy, which is those people in the upper the upper 5% of American income structure that wants to preserve its role as being the modern day aristocrats hiding under the guise of constitutional republic.
Okay, thanks, George. We're now going on to the Terra entity questions. Uranus, you have a question for George.
Yes. George, what are your thoughts about Cliff's latest theory, that of the expando planet? Do you believe in the doom as much as he does? And if so, has this theory had any impact on your preps?
Well, a couple of things. First, do I believe in expando planet? Yes. The reason I believe in expando planet is it makes a lot of sense because we all know Einstein's equation is E equals mc squared. Therefore, mass ought to be able to be created if you had enough energy over enough time. And the Earth is certainly a great big solar energy collector, and it's been here a very long time. So it would make sense that the radiant energy from the sun and the actinics and the non-visual energy, the radio energy and so forth, all that stuff, could certainly create matter. So that intuitively seems to make sense. Has that had any impact on my preparations? Yes, because it got me to do a lot of research on EMP, electromagnetic pulse problems, and sitting in my office is a a rather prominent metal garbage can that has a ham radio, an HF ham radio, as well as a little computer, which I know that it will survive anything I'm going to survive in terms of EMP from the sun or anything else for that matter. So I take that solar part of Terra incredibly seriously. Now, as to how bad it gets, that's a different matter. I have read a number of papers by NASA experts on the Carrington event and other coronal mass ejections. They seem to happen at the top or slightly after the top of a solar cycle, but not necessarily, and there's no guarantees with the sun. And you saw that internal flex currents were just announced in the last week as being the cause for the solar minima and solar maxima periods. It looks at this point like we're into at least a Dalton minimum, which is relatively small and may only last 1 or 2, perhaps 3 or 4 solar cycles, maybe 40, 50 years. But the shape of the current solar cycle does not preclude us from being in a Maunder minimum, which makes it kind of a big, ugly mess to try and figure out how to prepare for it. Because with a Maunder minimum, you get global cooling, which causes contraction of the surface of the Earth, which could trigger earthquakes, presumably. And I think you've seen there's a reader of mine, Tony Ring, and I put it on the Urban Survival site every month, has those dandy earthquake charts. And you can see there's very clearly a trend for the past 10 years or so in the magnitude 6, magnitude 7s. They've been increasing. Whether that is due to, and it also, by the way, seems to have a 22-year period to it when you look at it as a fifth-order polynomial. Not that you want to run right out and do that, but I'm just saying that there appears to be some periodicity to the earthquakes that seems to be related to the sun, and the expando planet discussion certainly makes sense. It's been kicked around that there's this convertibility of sun energy into matter, and that may in fact be one of the great mechanisms of how the whole universe operates. We just don't know because we're just dumb humans and haven't got it all figured out yet. In terms of my own preps, I've spent more money on some very high-speed electrical transient protection devices. So my solar panels, my inverter, my car, my tractor, my backup generator. I tried to install one in my wife last week. She wouldn't stand still for it, but nevertheless, yes, we do take that seriously.
Thank you
George.
very much, George.
Dead Poet, you've got a question for George.
Yeah, you've actually addressed some of the solar possibilities and the EMPs and there's so many possibilities of pole shifts and all these things, and we talk about this especially on the forum all the time. Do you and this is just something I like to look at Cliff's work and look at his specific brackets and just sort of look at it in a certain way. But do you think that the new electrics that he picks up on, do you think that could have anything to do with a change in polar magnetism? That as in we'll have to sort of birth new electronics in order to combat the magnetic changes that are going on in the Earth?
I don't think so. I think that the new electrics may have come out this past week. You saw, I presume, I think the story was out of the Philippines. Some guy has now got a car driven by a 12-volt battery that just keeps running and recharging itself. I don't know if you've seen that or not. But there are a number of devices which are being demonstrated informally that are very, very close to this over Unity stuff. I think that's the bulk of the new electrics. Now, whether there are other new electrics such as electrolevitation or other effects, we don't know yet, but I expect that we'll see that kind of thing too.
Thank you, George. Romans, you have a question for George.
Yes, George, I just wondered what your gut feel was for what's happening with all the language swirling around about the New Madrid fault, like, for instance, the government putting out for quote for all those millions of meals. And also, do you think it would be a false flag type situation?
Well, I think government doesn't do things without due consideration. If I were a consultant in strategic planning to the government, I would suggest that between the potential for an unusual, if not record-breaking, string of weather events because of what we've seen in Australia, because of the potential for an extraordinary spring with regard to tornadoes and mass destruction, because of potential crop losses and loading on the planet, because of New Madrid, because of the threat of EMP. It would only take a couple of EMP devices at the 200-kilometer level overhead to put the U.S. effectively in the dark, and with other potentials like Long Valley Caldera, Yellowstone, one of these is going to pop someday. So given that, when do you lay in your supply of food, especially if you could put it someplace where it could be in a temperature-controlled environment? I don't know how many MREs you've got stored, but there's a nice little chart. An MRE at 70 or 60 degrees will store for like 12 years. If it's at 80 degrees, it's like 3 years, and if it's 90 degrees, I think it's like 2. So storage temperatures means something. Given that, and given that food was relatively cheaper when the government started looking, I'm not sure I read anything particularly ominous into it, although there's an NLE, a national level exercise planned by FEMA later on this spring, as if a New Madrid were going to occur. Not saying they know anything about it, but we've had a lot of activity in Arkansas. Some speculate and some worry that that could be a new volcano trying to erupt, and that with the pressure off of the south end of that whole continental fault structure, with the oil being pricked out of that asphalt bubble down in the Gulf of Mexico, that it's possible that we could see some rather large crustal-type movement. How big it would be compared to the 1812 event, anybody's guess. Is it prudent, though, given the possibilities of social unrest, floods, terror, EMP, solar whatever, or ice age to stock up food? Yeah, it doesn't strike me as a paranoid thing to do. It strikes me as an eminently reasonable thing to do. But now here's the interesting thing. We can agree there's a broad spectrum of threats facing America. We can sit here on the WebBot forum and we can talk about it. But what's amazing to me is you're still talking 0.5%. I mean, those ads that Ready.gov is running about home preparedness, where people are floating around in anti-gravity. Well, that's pretty weird. That, by the way, is part of the reason that new electrics thing, I think, has a lot more distance to run. I don't know what percentage of the linguistics have filled on it, but my expectation is the world of science is going to be rewritten a lot.
Thank you, George.
Yep.
Thanks, Romans. Thanks, George. Uranus Rising, you have a question for George?
Yes, George. With the incoming solar and galactic energies, how do you see these affecting humans other than a possible mass die-off? I'm thinking in terms of mentally, psychologically, even spiritually.
All depends on the frequency. If you can give me a field intensity and a frequency I can give you a somewhat decent answer. Let me explain. Most energies coming in from space are of a particular frequency. Like, let's take an ultra low frequency, like the AM broadcast band. To an extent, AM broadcast radiation is non-ionizing. It'll just pass through your body, no harm, no foul. You start getting up to 50 megahertz or so, the 6-meter ham band, then radiation can cause a lot of heating, deep tissue heating and so forth, which can be very dangerous. Then as you move up in frequency, the effects move to the outer and outer and outer layers of the skin until at 2.4 gigahertz, about the frequency of your wireless router, or coincidentally very close to your microwave cook range frequency, you'll basically be heating up water near the surface of the skin, so you can burn the hell out of yourself, but it won't turn you into a drooling idiot. But then there are certain modulations that you can apply to microwave frequencies that will cause either pain on the surface of the skin, or can actually change behaviors of people, make people afraid, paranoid, and so forth. And we've had this whole area in the language that deals with people needing assistance because they turn into such drooling idiots. I don't know what that is. I don't think Cliff knows what that is. But the language, and I think you guys have read it too, that and it might have been back in the Alta reports, but we know that whatever is in that grouping, it's something that's weird, scary, and I don't want to be the first one on my block to get it. And if that means wearing tinfoil on my head, then by God, I'm going to tin up.
Well, it sounds like everything you're saying has been in the language. Thanks, George.
Yeah, it has. The problem is, until it starts showing up, there's not really a defensive measure I can wear, except I'm sitting on my desk here. One of my urban survival readers sent me a 1923 Danish Army helmet. That's one of those steel helmets like the Germans wore in World War II. The Danes got there first with these helmets that come down below the top of your, about basically to your collar. And I do wear that on occasion. I don't know if you've ever tried it, but if you wear a metal helmet or foil up your head, for some people, there is a noticeable psychological difference. And part of the reason is probably because we are so bathed in this RF energy. You can take an antenna wire, throw it up in the air, and in some parts of major cities, you can pull 1 or 2 watts of electricity free out of the air just with a bunch of diodes and an antenna, and you can actually light up an LED with it. I mean, field strengths are that strong, but it's relatively new stuff. The radio was only invented, 100 years ago, and we're all bathing in this stuff every single day, assuming that it won't change anything. And that's kind of an interesting gamble, and yet we don't see government in a big hurry to regulate exposures. The Russian radio frequency exposure limit was about half or less what the U.S. standard presently is. It doesn't make sense to me. So, yeah, I wear my metal helmet now and then.
Be sure and send us a photo of yourself.
I should. I should post one.
Thanks, Uranus. Thanks.
You bet.
Thank you. George in a German costume. Wow. Okay, question from Drownrod.
Yeah, we're only covering a fraction of all the questions we got for you, George. I hope we can have you back sometime.
Oh, yeah. I'll come back again.
Here's a question from Bluebird. In your musings on time slips, you mentioned mass hypnosis as possible to make us unable to see or sense hidden by design, people, or actions. We know from Barney's that we can be mass manipulated to believe or act a certain way, can a catalog of signs and symbols that will clue us in to who, when, how, where, and what is being hidden be developed?
Anything can be developed provided you've got a big enough budget and enough time and enough resource. In terms of you and me doing it, probably not. Here's what I was saying about time, though. You know how television is a sequence of, and motion pictures, a sequence of images, 30 images per second, and those images flicker with minute changes in each frame, and your consciousness averages that stuff out and turns it into a smooth movement. All I was saying about time slips is that there's that space between those frames of reality that we freeze on. There may be something there that is worth being discovered. The technology of getting there is scary. Some people think that psychotropic drugs will get you there, and therefore that has something to do with the weird time experiences that people using LSD and so forth have reported. Others say, no, it's really constant, and the only thing that's jumping around is our consciousness, which, in other words, reality is smooth. It's our perceptions that jumps around, and all drugs do is smooth it all out. So I really don't know. I mean, it's a really neat question. Unfortunately, we live in a world where the free exploration of science unbounded and the exploration of personal reality has been closely bounded by the powers that be, which have promoted different drug, alcohol, and so forth taboos. And likely the taboos are there because they are gateways to other layers of consciousness, which would make people less beholden to a particular power group. And so if you want to make people beholden to you, cut off their ability to personally access the source by making psychedelics, for example, illegal. And now it's a lot easier to brainwash them because you've got the only alternative out there. In a society such as we used to have on Earth, and it's well documented, by the way, in Graham Hancock's book, Supernatural, where he talks about the huge amount of archaeological evidence that supports very prolific drug use by ancient people. Is there something to be discovered there? Well, I don't know. They managed to build megalithic structures. You think so?
Yeah, thanks, George. George, as we end this discussion, we wanted to ask you one final question. We will have you back, probably for a separate show on survival, because that's a topic in itself.
Okay.
The economy is very important to all of us, but with Cliff's latest article, it seems the Earth changes may take front and center above everything else very shortly. Outside of Igor, you are the closest thing to a time mark. Our final question comes from Dead Poet.
Yes, George, definitely a time monk. And, we have hit you for 2 hours constantly asking you about doom, and we hear from Cliff and you about doom. But I want to know specifically, what you think humanity as a whole should do in order to stop this, all the things that we've talked about in this, all the causes per se, the symptoms, all the symptoms, and kind of get to the causes. But what do we do to keep this from happening again? And considering, for example, riots and destruction, they really don't solve anything. What would be some of your alternatives?
Well, assuming anybody makes it to 2015, the real question is, how do we keep from being enslaved or enchanted by either those who would pretend to lead us or those who would how do we keep ourselves from being enslaved? How do we keep ourselves from falling into a trance? I don't know the answer. All I know is that between here and there, the best we can possibly do is try to maintain a high level of awareness and ride this wave like a surfboard and hope some of us make it to the other side so that we can focus more on the cooperative nature, more on the sharing aspects of humanity, and not try to profit by emphasizing the distinctions and differences between one another.
Thank you so much, George. It's been a pleasure. Like a fine wine, you do get better with age. Don't let anyone tell you differently. Although
I must be a hell of a wine by now.
Yeah, Dom Perignon or something. Although not an official member of the Webbots, to many of us you are a true time monk. John Ford, the film director, said, "You can speak well if your tongue can deliver the message of your heart." As a modern-day Paul Revere, we are grateful for your daily commitment to getting the word out on your site and how your message speaks from your heart. On behalf of Fox and all the members of the Webbot Forum, thank you, George. May you and Elaine have many pies to come.
Thank you. And happy pie to you, too.
Thanks, George.
Okay.
Thank you very much, George.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you, George. That was great.
George.
I enjoyed it.
George.
I hope it was worthwhile.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely.
Cliff High said for me to tell you that you're a grumpy old bastard. Can you deny it on air?
I noticed put that into the actual interview.
No, but he's a raspy old bastard himself, and I defy him to. Yeah, I mean, we're really very different people philosophically. I mean, he's more of the Huckleberry clan, and I'm more of the peach or apple clan when it comes to pies. Yet we're still piemen at heart.
It's the crust that holds you together.
Well, I'm the
all
old
about.
crustier of us.
Okay, thanks, George.
Okay, have a great afternoon, guys.